Welcome, friends. We step into one of America's most haunting true crime mysteries. Stay close, this is a story you won't soon forget. It was the kind of quiet winter night that seems almost too still. The kind where even the snow outside holds its breath. Boulder, Colorado, was blanketed in soft white that Christmas evening of 1996, the festive glow of holiday lights twinkling against the dark. Behind the frosted windows of the Ramsey residence, an expansive, Tudor-style home on 15th Street, everything appeared warm, safe, and serene. Inside, the family was winding down from the excitement of Christmas Day. A 6-year-old girl named JonBenét Ramsey, the youngest in the family, had spent the day unwrapping presents, playing with her new toys, and basking in the doting attention of her parents, John and Patsy. The Ramsey house was the kind of place that could easily swallow sound, sprawling rooms, staircases that led into shadowed hallways, and a basement that stretched like a forgotten cavern beneath the festive chaos above. But that night, amid the decorations and the leftover holiday laughter, an invisible tension was already tightening its grip. Something, whether premeditated or impulsive, was about to happen within those walls. Something that would leave a mark not just on the Ramsey family, but on America's collective psyche. The clock was moving toward midnight when the house settled into sleep. John and Patsy were upstairs. Their 9-year-old son Burke was tucked away in his room, and JonBenét was said to be sleeping peacefully in her bed. Outside, the cold was biting well below freezing, and the neighborhood was silent. There were no sounds of car doors, no signs of movement. But the events of the next few hours would ignite one of the most notorious murder mysteries in U.S. history. At 5:52 a.m., the Boulder Police Department received a frantic 911 call from Patsy Ramsey. Her voice was high-pitched and panicked, trembling with the kind of fear that seems too large for words. "We have a kidnapping. Please hurry," she cried, explaining that she had found a ransom note lying on the back staircase. The note was a bizarre, sprawling 3-page message demanding $118,000 for the safe return of their daughter. The amount was oddly specific, eerily close to John Ramsey's annual bonus from work. The kidnapper or kidnappers claimed they were a small, foreign faction and warned against contacting the police or friends. Despite those instructions, Patsy called 911 immediately, and within minutes, friends and family were arriving at the house. The morning that followed was a chaotic blend of panic, confusion, and what many investigators would later call crucial mistakes. People wandered through rooms, touched surfaces, and moved items, unintentionally contaminating a crime scene before it was even formally secured. The ransom note itself was strange. It was long, far longer than any real-world ransom note typically is, and filled with odd phrases, inconsistent language, and theatrical threats. It opened with, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction." The tone fluctuated between menacing and strangely casual, even borrowing lines from popular movies. Investigators would later scrutinize every stroke of the handwriting, every peculiar word choice. But in that moment, the note was simply a terrifying promise that JonBenét was in danger. The police began to work under the assumption of a kidnapping, setting up containment around the Ramsey house and waiting for a phone call that never came. The hours ticked by in suffocating silence. There were no demands beyond the note, no proof of life, no instructions for a drop-off. The longer the morning dragged on, the more uneasy the investigators became. Then came the moment that would change the case entirely. Around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt suggested that John Ramsey and family friend Fleet White search the house from top to bottom to see if anything was amiss. Moving through the home, They descended into the basement, a dim, low-ceilinged space that felt far removed from the cheerful decor upstairs. At the far end, behind a latched white door, John made the discovery that would shatter any remaining hope: his daughter's body. JonBenét was lying on the cold concrete floor, covered with a white blanket. Her hands were bound above her head with a cord, and a makeshift garrote had been fashioned from a length of nylon cord and a broken paintbrush handle. Her mouth was covered with duct tape, her hair matted, her small frame eerily still. The scene was so horrifying, so out of place in a child's home, that even seasoned investigators would later recall the shock of it with a kind of numb disbelief. John lifted her body and carried her upstairs, placing her on the floor near the Christmas tree. To him, she was still his daughter. He could not leave her alone in the cold basement. But in doing so, any remaining chance of preserving untouched evidence vanished. By the time paramedics and officers surrounded the little girl's lifeless form, the crime scene had been irrevocably altered. In the days that followed, Boulder was consumed by the murder. News outlets latched onto every detail: the ransom note, the wealthy family, the beauty pageant photographs of JonBenét in sequined gowns and tiaras. The case became a media frenzy almost overnight. Beneath the surface of grief and public sympathy, whispers began whispers that would grow into one of the most divisive aspects of the investigation: suspicion directed at the Ramseys themselves. Police noted that there was no sign of forced entry into the home. The ransom note appeared to have been written on paper from a notepad inside the Ramsey house with a pen from the same source. Forensic analysis suggested it may have been written in the home after the family had returned from a Christmas party the night before. That alone raised troubling questions. Why would a kidnapper take the time to write such a lengthy note inside the victim's house, risking being discovered? Why demand such a strangely specific amount of money? And why was there no sign of the supposed break-in? The autopsy results deepened the mystery. JonBenét had suffered a blow to the head, causing a skull fracture nearly 8 inches long. She had also been strangled with the garrote. The medical examiner could not definitively determine whether the head injury or the strangulation had occurred first. There were also indications of prior vaginal injury, though whether these were from sexual abuse or from the events of that night remains one of the case's most disputed points. The darkness of the crime seemed to echo in every detail, casting long shadows over what had once been a picture-perfect family life. The Ramseys, once prominent figures in Boulder society, now found themselves under an invisible but crushing weight of suspicion. Police publicly said they were investigating all possibilities, but privately, their focus seemed to narrow. The first segment of the investigation was not just about gathering evidence, it was about navigating an increasingly hostile public perception. The image of JonBenét as a beauty pageant princess clashed sharply with the brutal reality of her death. The media amplified every contradiction, every possible motive, every family quirk that could be spun into a theory. And in the middle of it all was the ransom note, a sprawling, taunting manifesto that seemed to mock both the family and the investigators. Its strange mix of threats and familiarity would become a kind of haunting refrain in the case, a reminder that the person who had taken JonBenét's life had been close enough, comfortable enough, to linger in her home long enough to write it. Outside, Boulder's winter continued, snow falling silently over the city. But inside the Ramsey home, Christmas had frozen in time. The lights still twinkled, the tree still stood tall, and the gifts still sat beneath it, mute witnesses to a night that had transformed joy into horror. The police now faced a case unlike anything they'd encountered before. A murder with elements of a staged kidnapping, a note that defied criminal logic, and a crime scene irreversibly tainted by the very people desperate for justice. And somewhere, whether within the walls of the Ramsey home or far beyond, was someone who knew the truth. Someone who had taken a little girl's life and left behind a riddle that, decades later, remains unsolved. From the very first hours after JonBenét's body was found, the investigation seemed to be walking a fine, dangerous line between truth and speculation. Boulder, known for its quiet, affluent neighborhoods and low, violent crime rate, was unprepared for the brutal killing of a child, especially one from one of the city's most prominent families. The Ramseys were not just well off, they were socially connected. John was the president and CEO of Access Graphics, a successful computer distribution company that had recently celebrated a major financial milestone. Patsy, a former Miss West Virginia, was active in charity events and local high society. To their friends, they were the picture of success. But in the eyes of investigators, those layers of privilege and polish became potential camouflage for something darker. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into headlines. Could the killer be someone inside the Ramsey home that night? The ransom note was the first and loudest red flag. Forensic document examiners noted peculiarities in the handwriting similarities between the note and samples provided by Patsy Ramsey, though never enough for a definitive match. The paper came from a notepad in the house. The pen matched one from the home supplies. There was no evidence the note had been brought in from outside. The sheer length of it, 3 full pages, struck seasoned detectives as absurd. Criminal profilers agreed. Real kidnappers don't linger long enough to craft essays. They leave quick, concise demands, sometimes even printed to avoid handwriting analysis. This note read like a performance. Then there was the matter of the crime scene itself. The Ramseys insisted they had locked their doors that night, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry. The basement had small windows, one of which had been broken previously. John admitted to breaking it months earlier when he had locked himself out of the house, but there was no indication that anyone had crawled through recently. Dust and spider webs on the window well appeared undisturbed. The garrote was another grim puzzle. Made from nylon cord and part of a broken paintbrush handle, it had been tightly wound around JonBenét's neck. The paintbrush was traced back to Patsy's own art supplies stored in the basement. That detail struck investigators as chilling. The killer had used materials from within the house to create the murder weapon. Either the person responsible came prepared to kill and found convenient tools, or they had entered the house without fear of being caught long enough to improvise one. The autopsy deepened the darkness surrounding the case. JonBenet had a massive skull fracture, the kind that would have caused near-instant unconsciousness. She had also been strangled with the garrote, whether as the primary cause of death or to stage the scene, remained uncertain. There were small abrasions and evidence of possible vaginal trauma, sparking speculation about sexual abuse. Some forensic experts believed the injuries could be consistent with prior abuse, while others suggested they could have occurred during the assault that night. The ambiguity would fuel years of theories. Police procedure that day had been disastrously lax. Officers allowed friends, neighbors, and even the family's pastor to move freely around the home before the crime scene was fully processed. Cups of coffee were set down on counters. People wandered in and out of rooms. Critical evidence could have been destroyed in minutes. Detective Linda Arndt, the lone officer left in the house at one point, later said she was unnerved by the atmosphere too casual for a crime scene. When she saw John Ramsey carrying his daughter's body from the basement, she was shocked. In her training, removing a body without proper protocol was unthinkable. But in the chaotic swirl of that day, Nothing had followed normal procedure. The media coverage exploded almost instantly. Tabloid headlines blared across the country, juxtaposing haunting photographs of JonBenét in her pageant dresses with grisly crime scene details. Those images, feathers, sequins, bright lipstick, would become a point of controversy in themselves. To some, they reflected a mother's pride in her daughter's hobbies. To others, they suggested an unsettling sexualization of a child, making the case even more disturbing. As weeks passed without an arrest, suspicion hardened around the Ramseys. Investigators pointed to inconsistencies in their statements, perceived evasiveness in interviews, and what they saw as rehearsed public appearances. One detail that fueled speculation was that the Ramseys hired attorneys almost immediately. To law enforcement, that looked like a defensive move. To the Ramseys, it was a necessity. They believed they were being treated like suspects from day one. In the public's eyes, the narrative was splitting into two versions. Either the Ramseys were victims of a horrific break-in by a sadistic intruder, or they were carefully covering up a crime that happened within their own walls. Theories began to take shape. Some believed Patsy had accidentally killed JonBenét during a burst of anger, possibly over a bedwetting incident, a detail mentioned in some police notes, and staged the kidnapping to protect herself. Others thought John may have been involved in abuse and orchestrated a cover-up. Still others argued that Burke, the 9-year-old son, might have lashed out in a fit of sibling anger, and the parents staged the scene to protect him. The Ramsey family rejected these theories outright, going on television to declare their innocence. Their appearances on shows like CNN's Larry King Live were emotional, even defiant. "We did not kill our daughter," John said, his voice breaking. Patsy, in tears, begged the killer to come forward. But to many viewers, their public pleas only deepened the mystery. Some saw them as genuine, others as coldly calculated performances. While public opinion turned over every possibility, the police investigation was stumbling. The Boulder Police Department had little experience with high-profile homicide cases, and the FBI's involvement created jurisdictional tensions. Investigators disagreed on strategy. Some wanted to focus exclusively on the family. Others pushed for a broader search for intruders. Leads were pursued, then abandoned. Potential suspects outside the family, such as neighbors, former employees, and known criminals in the area, were questioned but never definitively linked to the crime. One particularly unsettling lead involved unidentified boot prints found near the basement window and an unidentified palm print on the wine cellar door. Neither matched any member of the Ramsey family, but without further evidence, those clues became just another set of loose threads in an already tangled case. The ransom note continued to torment investigators. Linguistic analysis suggested the author was well-educated and familiar with cinematic dialogue, borrowing lines from films like Dirty Harry and Speed. The phrase "foreign faction" was odd, almost theatrical. Experts believed it was meant to mislead, to plant the idea of an organized group, when the reality was likely a lone offender. But every angle raised more questions than answers. As the first month passed, the case was no closer to being solved. The Ramseys were formally interviewed in late April, 4 months after the murder, a delay that baffled many observers. By then, their legal team had prepared them extensively, and their answers revealed little that could be used as definitive evidence. Meanwhile, the grand jury convened in 1998 would hear volumes of testimony and review mountains of evidence, but ultimately, no one would be indicted. Through it all, the public fascination only deepened. News crews camped outside the Ramsey home. Tabloids ran wild with rumors. Amateur sleuths, long before the era of social media, true crime communities began dissecting every scrap of publicly available information. The case had transformed into a cultural phenomenon, not just a tragedy. The darkness of that winter night in Boulder had spread far beyond the Ramsey family. It had seeped into the national consciousness, a story too chilling to forget, yet too clouded in uncertainty to resolve. Every photograph of JonBenét, every reprint of the ransom note, every whispered theory seemed to drag the case deeper into a shadowed place where truth and speculation blurred into one. And somewhere, whether in the polished world of the Ramsey's social circle or lurking in the city's less visible corners, was the person or persons responsible for a crime so cruel that even decades later, its details remain like a wound that never fully heals. The winter of 1996 turned into the spring of 1997, but the shadow of JonBenét's murder didn't fade. In Boulder, the Ramsey home stood like a monument to unanswered questions. Neighbors avoided talking about it openly. Some whispered about seeing strangers in the area that Christmas. Others muttered that the truth had been inside the house all along. The investigation moved in fits and starts. By mid-1997, tensions between the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office were boiling. Police detectives believed the evidence pointed to the Ramseys, but the DA's team was less certain, worried about a trial that could collapse without rock-solid proof. In the middle of that tension sat the public, watching the case turn into a chess match of accusations and legal maneuvers. One of the key turning points came when the police began to focus on forensic evidence, particularly DNA. Under JonBenét's fingernails and in her underwear, forensic scientists found traces of unknown male DNA. It was not a full profile, but it was enough to rule out the Ramseys. To police, it was a puzzle piece that didn't fit neatly into the theory of an inside job. To the DA's office, it was a possible sign of an intruder, someone outside the family who had left a biological trace. But even that clue was slippery. Could it have been contamination from manufacturing or packaging of the underwear? Could it belong to someone who had innocently come into contact with her clothes at another time? Despite the uncertainty, the Ramseys were living under an unshakable cloud of suspicion. They appeared in television interviews, church gatherings, and press conferences, trying to keep their daughter's case in the public eye. But every appearance drew intense scrutiny. Body language experts dissected their facial expressions, speech analysts parsed every pause and emphasis, and tabloid headlines treated speculation as fact. In 1998, the case took a significant legal turn. Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to examine the evidence. For months, the grand jury reviewed testimony, forensic reports, and investigative findings behind closed doors. The public waited, anticipating an indictment. Then, in October 1999, Hunter made the announcement. There would be no charges against anyone. At the time, the decision seemed final, but nearly a decade later, in 2013, previously sealed grand jury documents revealed a shocking detail. The jury had actually voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. The DA at the time had simply chosen not to sign the indictment, citing insufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That revelation reopened old wounds and renewed debate over whether justice had been deliberately avoided. Meanwhile, the list of possible intruders grew longer and stranger. One theory centered on a neighborhood electrician with a criminal history. Another on a drifter spotted in the area, yet each lead seemed to dissolve into dead ends. In 2000, the Ramseys published a book, The Death of Innocence, laying out their version of events and insisting that an intruder had killed JonBenét. They described how their family had been persecuted by law enforcement and the media, but their attempt to reclaim the narrative also kept the case in the public arena, where every new theory was chewed over by talk shows, magazines, and a growing number of amateur sleuths on the internet. Then came one of the strangest turns in modern true crime history, the confession of John Mark Carr. It was 2006, 10 years after JonBenét's death, when Carr, a 41-year-old former schoolteacher living in Thailand, was arrested and publicly declared himself the killer. His detailed statements to authorities included descriptions of the night of the murder, claiming it was a tragic accident during what he called a sexual encounter. The confession made global headlines. News anchors speculated that the case had finally been solved. But within weeks, the excitement collapsed. DNA tests proved that Carr's genetic profile did not match the unknown male DNA from the crime scene. His story was riddled with inconsistencies, and many of his details about the house and the murder were wrong. Prosecutors dropped the case against him. He was eventually released, and his bizarre confession became another footnote in the case, a reminder of how high-profile crimes can attract false confessions and unbalanced personalities. The mid-2000s also brought developments in forensic science. DNA testing became more sensitive, allowing investigators to reanalyze evidence from the case. In 2008, Boulder's new district attorney, Mary Lacey, publicly cleared the Ramsey family, citing the DNA evidence as proof that an unknown male, not any member of the family, was responsible for the crime. But even that announcement failed to close the chapter. Critics pointed out that the DNA could have been the result of contamination, and skeptics still believed the Ramseys had orchestrated a cover-up. By then, Patsy Ramsey was battling ovarian cancer. She died in 2006 at age 49, never having seen the case solved. Her death added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story, and for some, it permanently sealed away answers that might have come only from her. The years that followed saw the case move in and out of the headlines, often triggered by new documentaries, books, or TV specials. In 2016, the 20th anniversary of JonBenét's death brought a flood of renewed interest. CBS aired The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, in which a team of experts argued that Burke, the Ramsey's son, may have been responsible for the fatal blow to JonBenét's head, and that the parents covered it up. The program sparked outrage from the Ramsey family, and Burke, then 29 years old, filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit against CBS, which was eventually settled. What emerged over time was a portrait not of a straightforward crime, but of a mystery entangled in human flaws, investigative missteps, prosecutorial caution, media sensationalism, and the inevitable erosion of physical evidence over decades. The case became as much about the culture around it as about the murder itself, a mirror reflecting America's obsession with beauty, privilege, and scandal. The Boulder Police Department has maintained that the case remains open. The home where JonBenet was killed has changed owners several times, each new resident inheriting a piece of the property's haunted legacy. Private investigators, journalists, and internet detectives continue to sift through the same set of facts, hoping for a breakthrough that might come from new technology or a sudden confession. But the deeper one goes into the case files, the more it feels like staring into a hall of mirrors. Every clue has two interpretations. Every suspect has both guilt and innocence woven into their story, and every theory is shadowed by doubt. Perhaps the most chilling element, even after all these years, is that the killer, whether an intruder who slipped in and out unnoticed, or someone within the Ramsey household, has never been held accountable. And as long as that remains true, the story of JonBenét Ramsey will never rest quietly in history. It will linger in the American imagination, a case where the line between truth and fiction is as thin as the paper on which a ransom note was written in the quiet hours of Christmas night. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey exists today less as a single criminal act and more as a cultural phenomenon, a story that has been retold, dissected, and reimagined for nearly 3 decades. Yet beneath the layers of speculation and media frenzy lies a reality that remains unchanged. A 6-year-old girl was brutally killed in her own home, and no one has ever been convicted. By the time the second decade after her death rolled around, the case had become an archetype of the American true crime story. The wealthy family, the picture-perfect child, the holiday setting, the bizarre ransom note, and the fracture in public opinion. Each detail seemed almost too cinematic, and perhaps that's why it lodged itself so deeply in the public consciousness. But those same details, the ones that made the case unforgettable, are also what have kept it mired in uncertainty. The 3 dominant theories. Over the years, the vast pool of speculation has condensed into 3 primary schools of thought. This is the theory most strongly supported by the Ramsey family and, in later years, by the Boulder District Attorney's Office. According to this view, someone entered the Ramsey home late on Christmas night, 1996, possibly through a basement window or another vulnerable point. They wrote the ransom note inside the house on a pad of paper from the Ramsey's own kitchen, then took JonBenét to the basement, where the crime occurred. Supporters of this theory point to the unknown male DNA found on her clothing, the unidentified footprint on the basement floor, and the strange use of the family's own duct tape and cord suggesting a perpetrator improvising with whatever was at hand. Some believe the killer was a stalker who had fixated on JonBenét through her child beauty pageant appearances. Others think it could have been a burglar who panicked when confronted by her. Critics of the intruder theory often argue that the most likely suspects in any child homicide are the parents or close relatives. In this theory, either John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey accidentally or intentionally caused JonBenét's death, and the ransom note was a staged attempt to mislead investigators. Proponents cite the unusual length and phrasing of the ransom note, which contained multiple references to the Ramseys' personal life and even films like Dirty Harry. They also question why the note was written in the house rather than brought in by the supposed kidnapper, a risky move if the perpetrator feared being caught. Within this theory are sub-variations, such as the Burke theory, which suggests JonBenét was killed after a sudden altercation with her brother, possibly during a moment of anger, with the parents covering it up to protect their son. A less discussed but persistent idea is that the crime was committed by someone outside the family, but that the Ramseys knew the person or at least suspected them and chose to protect them. This could explain why some elements of the crime scene suggest staging, while others point to an intruder. Such theories often hinge on the belief that the family's social connections and reputation were factors in how the investigation unfolded. Each of these theories has vocal defenders and detractors, and each is supported by evidence that can be interpreted in multiple ways. The result is a case where every clue seems to point in 2 directions at once: the media's grip. If the police investigation was fractured and inconclusive, the media coverage was relentless. From the very beginning, the case was a magnet for cable news, tabloid headlines, and later true crime documentaries and podcasts. In many ways, JonBenét's story became the template for modern media crime coverage, a blend of real investigation, armchair detective work, and sensationalism. The early internet played a role too. Online message boards in the late 1990s became hubs for Ramsey sleuths, many of whom pored over crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and transcripts, creating sprawling threads of amateur analysis. While some of these discussions were insightful, Others devolved into rumor-mongering and personal attacks, further blurring the line between fact and speculation. By the time the 2010 S rolled around, the case was as much a part of pop culture as it was a legal mystery. Dramatized retellings appeared in TV movies. Comedians referenced it in stand-up routines. Even Halloween costumes drew from the imagery of the case, something that horrified many observers, who saw it as proof of the public's detachment from the human tragedy at its core. Advances in forensics and the hope for resolution. As technology advanced, hope periodically flared that a new scientific breakthrough might finally identify the killer. The unknown male DNA profile remained the most tantalizing clue. With each leap in DNA technology, from ester testing to touch DNA to whole genome sequencing, investigators retested the evidence, searching for a match in national databases. In 2021, renewed efforts were announced to use cutting-edge genetic genealogy, the same technique that had led to the capture of the Golden State Killer, to trace the unidentified DNA. The idea was simple in theory, but complex in execution. If the DNA could be linked to distant relatives in a public genealogy database, investigators might build a family tree that would eventually point to the killer. Yet as of now, no public announcement has been made about a successful identification. The Ramsey family, especially John Ramsey, has been vocal about urging law enforcement to prioritize and expedite this process, expressing frustration that decades have passed without closure. The psychological toll. For those closest to JonBenét, the murder was not just a crime, but a wound that never healed. Patsy's death from cancer in 2006 left John and Burke to navigate both grief and ongoing public scrutiny. Burke, who was only 9 at the time of his sister's death, largely avoided the public eye until 2016, when he gave an interview on Dr. Phil. The appearance sparked debate about his demeanor. Some viewers interpreted his nervous smile as unsettling, while others saw it as the coping mechanism of someone who had lived most of his life under suspicion. The case also had a lasting effect on the city of Boulder. For a community that prided itself on safety and affluence, the Ramsey murder was a rupture in its self-image. It became a cautionary tale that no amount of privilege, preparation, or protection could guarantee immunity from violence. The unfinished story. Today, more than 28 years later, JonBenét's death remains unsolved. Her grave in Marietta, Georgia, lies beside her mother's, marked by a polished stone with a photograph etched into it. Visitors still leave flowers, toys, and notes. Some come for personal reasons, perhaps, because they lost a child themselves. Others come because the case has haunted them since 1996. The house on 15th Street in Boulder still stands, its facade changed slightly by renovations, but its history unaltered. Every time it goes on the market, news outlets run fresh stories and old photos of the Christmas lights from that fateful winter resurface. For the people who once lived there, it is not just a property, it is the place where a nightmare was written to the walls. There is a certain cruelty in cases that remain unresolved. They hold survivors in a kind of limbo, where grief cannot fully turn to mourning because the wound is still open. In JonBenét's case, the lack of resolution has also allowed the story to evolve into something larger than the facts, a myth, a mirror, and a mystery all at once. Closing reflection. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about the JonBenét Ramsey case is not simply that it is unsolved, but that it may remain unsolved forever. The killer, whether a stranger slipping into a darkened home or someone within the circle of trust, has had decades of silence in which to disappear into the fabric of ordinary life. They may walk among us unnoticed, They may be gone. They may even be watching the world still speculate about what happened that night. And yet the case persists in the collective memory, because JonBenét's story contains something primal, the shattering of innocence, the collapse of safety, and the enduring question of who could do such a thing. Until the day the truth emerges, if it ever does, the shadow of that cold Christmas night in Boulder will stretch on, silent and unresolved, over the pages of true crime history. JonBenét Ramsey's name will remain etched not only in stone, but in the deepest corners of America's fascination with the darkness that sometimes hides in plain sight. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share